Before becoming the leading global exporter of crude oil, Saudi Arabia was once a bleak wasteland, teeming with tribes just to fight for survival. The country had very little economic activity, and besides Mecca, they had little to offer. But all of this changed on March 3, 1938, when the Americans discovered the world's greatest oil reserves. Over the next few decades, most of the earnings from the area flowed to the Americans, leaving Saudi Arabia with pitiful dividends. However, Saudi Arabia gradually accumulated these earnings and began purchasing these oil businesses drilling across their country. By 1980, the Saudi government had increased their stake to 100%, making them the proprietors of the world's most profitable company, Saudi Aramco. Since then, Saudi Aramco has transformed the area into a contemporary desert oasis. While their cities are more stylish than Western ones, they still have one catastrophic bottleneck: oil accounts for 92% of their budget. Most of us now believe that Saudi Arabia has enough oil to last for several decades, if not a century. Many analysts, however, disagree because there is evidence that Saudi Arabia may have lied about its oil reserves. So how much longer before Saudi Arabia runs out of oil? Now, prepare your basic math skills as we will talk about how much oil reserve is left and how they can affect you. Let's begin by looking at their sketchy information. There are reasons why analysts are skeptical about Saudi Arabia's oil reserve. Saudi Arabia is thought to have 260 billion barrels of oil remaining. And during the last decade, Saudi Arabia has produced nearly 10 million barrels of oil every day on average. This indicates that Saudi Arabia produces around 3.65 billion barrels of oil each year. According to estimates, Saudi oil reserves will barely last another 60 years at present extraction rates. In 2020 research for the Brookings Institute, in the medium term, revenues from oil are expected to decline in the face of reductions in global demand starting around 2040, if not sooner. This is partly because, in the long run, the Western world is attempting to abandon fossil fuels entirely. Though it may benefit Saudi Arabia now, the crisis in Ukraine is hastening the planned switch to renewable energy. In Europe, it is considered a way for the continent to become less reliant on fossil fuel suppliers such as Russia and Saudi Arabia. This may appear to be a long way away, but keep in mind that Saudi Arabia has already been collecting oil revenue for 84 years. This means that Saudi Arabia is more than halfway through its oil rollercoaster ride. However, things may be much worse, not only for them, but for us. For decades, we've gotten all our oil reserve estimates from Saudi Arabia, and the data is a little shaky. To begin with, Saudi Arabia's oil reserves suddenly increased from 170 billion to 260 billion in 1989. However, all of Saudi Arabia's major oil reserves were discovered between 1936 and 1970. And given that no such discoveries have occurred in the last 50 years, how could their reserves appear to increase by 90 billion barrels overnight? Another thing to note is that the timing of this jump was extremely shaky. Although Saudi Arabia took over Aramco in 1980, it wasn't until 1988 that the Americans were ultimately thrown out and Saudi rule was established. And yet, just 1 year after this leadership shift, their oil reserves increased by 50%. So the experts smelled something fishy and began their investigation only to find out that Saudi Arabia has claimed that its oil reserves have not changed in 33 years. Given how much oil they've pumped out over the last 33 years, this doesn't seem very realistic. By the way, are you enjoying this video? Please give it a like and hit the subscribe button if you like business, economy, and crypto content. It really helps me grow the channel. Now let's go back to Saudi's oil output graph. We can observe that Saudi Arabia has averaged around 8.5 million oil barrels per year during the last 3 decades. This equates to a total oil output of 102 billion barrels. Furthermore, if we examine the Saudi reserve data more closely, we can observe that they have not only claimed that their oil reserves have remained steady, but have actually increased. There were 258 billion barrels of oil in 1990, but there were 266 billion barrels of oil in 2016. This means that Saudi Arabia not only pumped out 102 billion barrels in the last 30 years, but also came out ahead by 8 billion barrels. In other words, since the Americans left, Saudi Arabia has been able to discover 110 billion barrels. This is in addition to the initial 90 billion barrel increase. So it appears that Saudi Arabia has found a total of 200 billion barrels of oil since taking over. Remember that this figure is 30 billion barrels higher than what Americans assumed Saudi Arabia possessed in the total in the 1980s. Now, I understand that many people dislike Americans, but one thing I believe we can all agree on is that Americans are masters of capitalistic exploitation. So the idea that the Americans plundered Saudi Arabia for 50 years and didn't even locate half of their oil reserves, aka 200 billion barrels, seems a little dubious to me. Still, I'll leave that up to you to decide. The proof of lies. Well, it's not simply the data that indicates contradictions. Over the years, there have been several essential leaks that suspected that Saudi Arabia is lying. In 2011, for example, WikiLeaks claimed to have obtained insider information from a high-ranking Saudi oil official. According to the executive, Saudi Arabia has overstated its oil reserves by up to 300 billion barrels over the years. It's also worth noting that Saudi Arabia has never been able to increase production by that amount. If they genuinely discovered another 200 billion, you'd think they'd have plenty of fresh oil fields to dig and expand out. Regardless, they've been unable to surpass what the Americans have accomplished, 10 million barrels per day. You see, is nothing new. In fact, the United States achieved this level alongside Saudi Arabia in 1980 when they surpassed 9.9 million barrels per day. In the 42 years since, the Saudis have only reached 10.7 million barrels per day. The Saudis do not appear to be holding back either. For example, despite Donald Trump's threat to remove military backing, Saudi Arabia could not increase output to above 10.5 million barrels per day. You may argue that Saudi Arabia refused to respond to threats, but they couldn't increase production even when they were the ones issuing the threat. Remember when oil prices plummeted between 2014 and 2016? Saudi Arabia was a major contributor to the drop in oil prices from $120 to $42. The United States, you see, was making progress in getting oil from oil shales. This meant that the United States would become less reliant on oil from the Middle East. As a result, Saudi Arabia and OPEC decided to wage a price war against shale oil producers. The plan was to increase oil production while simultaneously lowering oil prices to drive these extractors out of business. This would have been an ideal opportunity for Saudi Arabia to increase output to 15 or perhaps 20 million barrels per day, but they could only reach 11 million barrels. Clearly, Saudi Arabia cannot exceed the ceiling set by the Americans, raising the possibility that they've been lying about reserves. So you're wondering, wouldn't it be better for Saudi Arabia if everyone knew the country's oil reserves were depleted? Less supply equals higher pricing, so Saudi Arabia will earn more, right? Well, this would be true at first, but it would not last long. Even with Saudi Arabia's probable overstated estimates, the country does not have the world's greatest oil reserve. This honor belongs to Venezuela, which has 300 billion barrels of oil. Venezuelan oil has never been beneficial to the rest of the globe because the country has been plagued by corruption, hyperinflation, and who knows what else. However, once the world realizes that Saudi Arabia does not have as much as they said, they will shift their entire focus to other countries. Venezuela and Canada will make historic strides. Then the Western world might even make peace with Russia. At the same time, the push for renewable energy will be stronger than ever before, reducing the world's reliance on Saudi Arabia. And given that oil is the only thing that provides Saudi Arabia any type of clout in the global economic arena, this would be counterproductive. It's in their best interest to keep the rest of the world as reliant on their oil as possible. If it necessitates lying about their oil reserves, then be it. For Saudi Arabia, the countdown has already begun. While they may be bluffing about having 70 to 100 years of oil left, they most likely have a few decades. This is consistent with the kingdom's behavior. If they genuinely had several decades of oil left, I doubt they'd be focusing all their efforts on expanding other revenue streams. Saudi Arabia has made incredible progress in embracing Western standards during the last few years. Women's and human rights have improved dramatically, and the country has been open to tourism for the first time. They've also been pouring billions of dollars into airports and tourism sites, indicating that they're aiming to make the country into a tourist hotspot like Dubai. There's also the Vision 2030 project, led by Mohammed bin Salman, which intends to dramatically reduce the country's reliance on oil. The strategy includes everything from seemingly fantastical plans to build Neom, a massive eco-city 33 times the size of New York, complete with a ski resort called Trojana and the world's tallest buildings, to more manageable plans like improving ease of doing business, streamlining government services, and enhancing religious tourism. If such initiatives succeed, I believe Saudi Arabia will be self-sufficient in oil by the time they run out. So while they may be deceiving the entire world about their reserves, they are not fooling themselves, and they are preparing for a future without oil. While we can argue that lying about their reserve is dishonest and deceitful, they've actually played their cards exceptionally successfully. They have maintained their supremacy in the oil sector by overstating their reserves. Their crude oil shipments are more than double those of second place. This has enabled them to amass over $500 billion in the war chest. They also floated Saudi Aramco a few years ago at a $2 trillion valuation, so it appears they're looking to cash out there as well. Meanwhile, they've begun to diversify their income streams, so it seems Saudi Arabia will do exceedingly well, even once the oil runs out. As for the rest of us, we may not have as much oil as anticipated, but that may be a good thing. Maybe this is just what we need to finally transition into renewable energy and put our gas-guzzling days behind us, but that's just my opinion. Do you believe Saudi Arabia's oil reserves are questionable? Let me know in the comment section below. If you learned something new from today's video, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon to be the first to see my next video. I make deep dives like this every week, uncovering the secrets of money and business.